Dr. Taylor didn't waste another second. He turned back to the patient, checking their pulse, adjusting the oxygen mask. He was running out of time, and every unnecessary delay could mean the difference between life and death. "Stay with me," he murmured to the patient, his fingers tightening around their wrist. He could feel how weak their pulse was, too weak. Bradley swallowed hard. Who is this?" His voice was hoarse, almost afraid of the answer. Dr. Taylor shot him a sharp look. "You don't even know. You just attacked me without thinking, and now you want details." His voice was low, controlled, but the anger in his eyes was unmistakable. "Step aside. I don't have time for your second thoughts." The patient stirred slightly, their eyes fluttering open just enough to meet Bradley's. A flicker of recognition passed between them, and whatever breath he had left caught in his throat. His world tilted. His face paled even further, and for a moment he felt weightless, like the ground beneath him had disappeared. Memories rushed in, uninvited and unstoppable. This wasn't just anyone. This wasn't some random person being transported to the hospital. This was personal. The paramedic, growing impatient, revved the engine. "Last warning, officer. Either let us go or ride with us and explain yourself at the hospital." Bradley's jaw clenched. Every instinct told him to stop interfering, to let them go, but his pride, his past, held him in place. He hesitated, but before he could finish, a faint, rasping voice interrupted him. "Bradley." It was the patient, speaking his name. The sound shattered whatever illusion he had left that this was just another call. Dr. Taylor's gaze darted between the two, his frustration momentarily replaced by curiosity. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice still sharp but edged with something else now. Suspicion. Bradley took a shaky step back, his chest tightening. He wanted to deny it, to act like this didn't mean anything, but the truth was staring him in the face. And no matter what he did next, there was no escaping it. The sound of his name coming from the patient's lips sent a chill down Bradley's spine. He took another step back, his fingers twitching at his side. His mind screamed at him to pull himself together, to regain control, but he couldn't shake the weight pressing down on his chest. Dr. Taylor watched the exchange closely. He had been around enough emergencies to know when something deeper was at play. He glanced at the patient, their face pale, barely able to keep their eyes open, yet somehow still focused on Bradley. This wasn't just recognition, it was something heavier, something unspoken. "Officer," Dr. Taylor said, his voice calmer now, but no less firm. "We are leaving. If you have something to say it now, or get out of the way." Bradley's throat tightened. His world was closing in around him, every choice suddenly feeling impossible. The weight of his past, the weight of his actions, it all crashed into him at once. He looked at the patient again, really looked at them, and the memory hit like a punch to the gut. Years ago, a different city, a different night, but the same eyes staring back at him. The paramedic, growing increasingly tense, gripped the steering wheel. "This isn't a debate. We are leaving." The tires rolled forward an inch. "Either get in or step aside." Bradley's heart pounded. His fingers hovered near his radio, the static humming softly, waiting for him to make a decision. If he let them go, this moment would define him. If he stopped them, he wasn't sure he could live with what happened next. Dr. Taylor's voice cut through the tension. "You're afraid, aren't you?" His gaze didn't waver. "Afraid of what happens when this patient makes it to the hospital, afraid of what they might say." The words struck deep, but Bradley said nothing. He just stood there, the weight of his past pressing in from all sides, knowing that no matter what happened next, there was no turning back. The air inside the ambulance felt heavy, thick with tension that refused to break. Bradley's jaw tightened as Dr. Taylor's words echoed in his mind. Afraid. He wanted to deny it, to fight back, but the truth had already wrapped around him like a vice. Before he could say anything, the patient shifted slightly, struggling against the pain that held them down. Their fingers twitched, reaching weakly toward Bradley. Then, barely above a whisper, the words came. "You don't even remember me, do you?" The pilot exhales sharply, forcing a stiff nod. He turns without another word and steps into the cockpit, yanking the door shut behind him. Malcolm leans forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees. His mind is turning. He's met plenty of people like this, people who underestimate him, who can't accept that he belongs in spaces they believe are off limits. But this isn't just about attitude. This pilot is on edge, and that's a problem. Rachel lingers near Malcolm's seat, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "I'm so sorry about that," she says, her voice low. "I don't know what his problem is, but this isn't normal." Malcolm glances at her, giving her a small, reassuring nod. "I know," he says simply, because he does. Then, just as the engines hum louder, ready for takeoff, a loud thud echoes from the cockpit. Everyone freezes. The co-pilot jerks his head around. Rachel's breath catches in her throat. Malcolm slowly straightens in his seat, his eyes locked on the closed cockpit door. Something isn't right, and whatever it is, it's about to change everything. The sound of the thud still lingers in the cabin, making the air feel heavier. Everyone is frozen for a moment, eyes locked on the cockpit door. The co-pilot hesitates, then unbuckles his seatbelt and pushes himself up. Something is wrong. Even he knows it now. Malcolm doesn't move, but he watches everything. His instincts are sharp, and right now, they're telling him that whatever just happened in that cockpit isn't normal. He glances at Rachel, whose hands are now gripping the back of a seat. She looks nervous, unsure whether to speak or stay quiet. Another sound, this time softer, like a heavy breath against a microphone. Then silence again. The co-pilot takes a cautious step forward and knocks on the cockpit door. "Captain," no answer. Malcolm straightens in his seat, tension settling into his shoulders. He's not the type to panic. He didn't build his empire by losing his cool. But right now, the situation is shifting fast, and he doesn't like what it's turning into. Rachel finally speaks up, her voice barely above a whisper. "Should we do something?" The co-pilot doesn't answer right away. He knocks again, harder this time. "Captain, I need you to respond." Still nothing. Then, just as the co-pilot reaches for the door, there's movement. A slow, dragging sound from inside the cockpit. Malcolm hears it clearly, and something about it makes his pulse quicken. The co-pilot's hand hovers over the handle, unsure whether to open the door or call for help. And then the cockpit door unlocks. The silence that follows is almost worse than the noise. The door slowly creaks open just an inch, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. The co-pilot hesitates. Rachel takes a step back. "Malcolm," he leans forward, eyes narrowing. "Because whatever is on the other side of that door, it's about to answer every question that's been building since this flight began." And something tells him, this pilot's bad attitude is the least of their problems. The crack in the cockpit door remains still, like an open question no one is ready to answer. The co-pilot stands frozen, his hand hovering near the handle, his breath uneven. Rachel grips the seat beside her, eyes darting between Malcolm and the door, waiting for someone to make the first move. Then, the door slowly swings open. The pilot stands there, barely. His face is pale, his forehead damp with sweat. His breathing is uneven, almost labored. His eyes, the same ones that had been filled with resentment just moments ago, now hold something else entirely: fear. Malcolm watches him carefully, his instincts on high alert. Something is wrong, seriously wrong. The arrogant pilot from before looks nothing like the man standing in front of them now. He opens his mouth to speak, but no words come out. Instead, his knees buckle. The co-pilot lunges forward, catching him before he collapses completely. "Captain," he shouts, but there's no response. The pilot's head tilts to the side, his breath's ragged. His fingers twitch as he clutches at his chest, his whole body trembling. Rachel gasps. Malcolm, still seated, watches it all unfold, his mind racing. The pieces click together fast. This isn't just nerves. This isn't some sudden panic attack. This is something worse. Then, out of nowhere, the pilot grabs the co-pilot's shirt, his grip surprisingly strong. His lips part, and this time, a single strained word escapes. Poison. The world tilted again. Bradley's breath caught in his throat. His skin went cold. He stared at the patient, his mind scrambling to put the pieces together. How could this person, this frail, broken figure, know him? Dr. Taylor's gaze flickered between them. He didn't have the full picture yet, but he knew something big was unraveling right in front of him. "Who are they, officer?" His voice was quieter now, but just as demanding. Bradley didn't answer. He couldn't. The paramedic had had enough. "I'm not waiting any longer," he snapped, gripping the wheel. "You need to move now." The ambulance jolted forward another few inches. Bradley stumbled back, but his eyes never left the patient. His pulse hammered against his ribs, the weight of something old and buried clawing its way back to the surface. Then, just as he was about to step aside, a voice crackled over his radio. "Unit 34, we have a report of an officer-initiated stop involving an active emergency vehicle. Confirm status." Silence. Dr. Taylor clenched his jaw, glancing at the patient, then back at Bradley. "What's it gonna be?" Bradley swallowed hard, the radio hissing in his ear. His fingers hovered over the button. He could respond. He could call it in. But something told him that if he did, he wouldn't just be ending this moment. He'd be opening a door he might never be able to close. And just as he hesitated, the patient let out a breath and whispered a name. Not his, but one that made his blood run cold. Bradley froze. The name hung in the air, sinking into his chest like a weight he couldn't shake. His stomach twisted. He hadn't heard that name in years. It belonged to someone he had tried to forget, someone connected to a night he had buried deep in his past. Dr. Taylor's eyes sharpened. He didn't know the full story, but he saw the shift in Bradley's face, the flicker of fear behind his eyes. "Who is that?" he asked, his voice calm but relentless. Bradley didn't answer. He couldn't. His fingers twitched over his radio, his mind racing. If this patient was connected to ***, then everything he had built, everything he had convinced himself was behind him, was about to come crashing down. The ambulance lurched forward again, this time more forcefully. "We're done here," the paramedic muttered. "If you're not arresting anyone, get out of the way." But Bradley barely heard him. His heart pounded in his ears. He stared at the patient, watching as their breathing grew shallower. This wasn't just an emergency call anymore. It was a reckoning. Then the patient's eyes met his one last time. A weak smile touched their lips. "You thought no one would remember," they whispered. "But I did." A chill ran through him. The past slammed into him like a tidal wave. Flashes of a different night, a different street, a different decision. One he had walked away from, thinking it would never catch up to him. Dr. Taylor's voice cut through the haze. "You can't change what happened back then, but you can make the right call now." Bradley swallowed hard. His whole body felt locked in place. The radio crackled again, waiting for his response. Then, in one swift motion, he reached up, clicked the radio off, and stepped back. "Go," he said. His voice was hoarse but firm. The paramedic didn't wait for a second chance. The ambulance rolled forward, sirens screaming into the night, leaving Bradley standing alone under the flashing red and blue lights. He exhaled shakily, running a hand over his face. He had let them go. But he knew this wasn't over, because the past had finally caught up to him, and now it wouldn't let go. The night felt quieter without the blaring sirens, but inside Bradley's head, the noise hadn't stopped. He stood frozen on the pavement, watching the ambulance disappear down the road, its taillights fading into the distance. His pulse was still hammering, his body tense, but the moment was over. The decision had been made. Dr. Taylor was gone. The patient was on their way to the hospital. And Bradley, he was left standing there, alone with the weight of everything that had just happened. He let out a slow breath, but it did nothing to steady him. The radio on his shoulder crackled again. Unit 34, status update. His fingers hovered over the button. For years, he had operated on instinct, on control. He had built his career on being the one in charge, the one who decided how situations played out. But tonight, he had lost that control. And maybe, just maybe, that was exactly what needed to happen. The night was supposed to be like any other for Dr. Marcus Taylor. As an experienced emergency physician, he had seen it all: accidents, heart attacks, and life-or-death situations where every second mattered. But nothing could have prepared him for what was about to happen on this call. The wailing siren of the ambulance cut through the quiet streets as he sat in the back, working tirelessly to stabilize the critically injured patient lying before him. His hands moved with precision, his mind focused, until the vehicle came to a sudden, jarring stop. Outside, red and blue lights flashed in the dark. Officer Bradley, a veteran cop with a reputation for being aggressive, had pulled them over. His face was tight with suspicion as he approached the driver's window. "License and registration," he demanded, his voice sharp. The paramedic behind the wheel barely had time to explain that they were transporting a critical patient before the officer's eyes landed on the man in the back, Dr. Taylor. Something in Officer Bradley shifted. His stare hardened. He saw a black man in scrubs and made his own assumptions. "Step out of the vehicle," he barked, his hand moving toward his holster. Dr. Taylor, confused but composed, held up his hands. "Officer, I'm a doctor. We have a patient fighting for their life in here," he explained, his voice steady, but Bradley wasn't listening. The next moments happened too fast. The officer yanked open the door, grabbing Dr. Taylor's arm. The paramedic shouted in protest, but before anyone could react, a fist connected. Pain exploded across Dr. Taylor's jaw as he stumbled back, catching himself against the gurney. The heart monitor beside him beeped urgently, a reminder of the real emergency at hand. And then, before the officer could escalate things further, a voice from inside the ambulance changed everything. A voice that made the blood drain from Bradley's face. A voice that, in an instant, turned his reckless decision into something he would regret